Let's be honest for a second. F1 sprint races are not that good. Ever since their inception in 2021, the idea of more racing was good on paper, but the actual execution hasn't been up to the standards in the eyes of most fans. I personally love the idea of more racing, but in their current state, they just don't do well, and that seems to be a popular idea of a large portion of the fan base. Next week in Brazil, it could easily make me look real stupid right now, as there's no such thing as a bad race at Interlagos. But at the end of the day, a majority of these sprints do suck. At first, the whole idea of the sprints were simply to just have more racing action. Basically, in Liberty Media terms, races have more viewership than practice, and more viewership equals more money. But that seems to be the extent to which the process was thought out. The current format of these races right now are simply just boring and seen as a spoiler for the first stint of the actual race. With one practice session, two qualifying sessions, and two race sessions, barring any weather changes or big safety car or red flag moments, the sprint really is just a little trailer of what to expect in the real race. Also, with the current format having the sprint and normal race events separate, and separate qualifying sessions, the weekend gets hectic. A lack of free practice running hinders both drivers with acclimation and the teams with gathering data, so it's not exactly convenient. And with the sprint taking place only a few hours before qualifying, a crash in the sprint could jeopardize the rest of the race weekend for a driver, which usually isn't worth it for so little points to offer in the sprints. So the format kind of falls flat. The older format wasn't great either, though. Having the same qualifying session eliminated the issue of too many sessions, but this time, if you crash in the sprint, it didn't just have the chance to ruin your whole weekend, it was a guarantee. Having the finishing position in the sprint be the deciding factor as to where these guys start on the race day was never going to work out well, and it's a good thing F1 noticed that early on. But in general, there are too many deeply rooted problems in the format that really make them undesirable. First, they simply just aren't rewarding enough. Having a maximum of 8 points up for grabs and it only going down to P8 really doesn't give much to fight for. For the top drivers, the gain that they're able to have over competitors is so minimal, with the position behind only gaining 1 point less than them, and it becomes more of a battle to finish the race than challenge for more points. On the other end of the grid, there really isn't much opportunity for the midfield in these sprints. With the points only stretching down to P8, unless the top constructors have DNFs like in Austin, the points usually consist of only 4 constructors. For example, in past years, the top 8 tends to be some sort of mix of Red Bulls, Mercedes, Ferraris, and McLarens, with a mishap from one of those teams that usually allows another team to slip in a point in 8th. Just looking at those results makes the sprint seem boring, but you'd probably assume that there's at least some action going on in the races, right? Wrong. There obviously are some levels of action, but nothing you would deem exceptional for a format that F1 labels flat out aggressive melee from start to finish. I don't put all the blame for that on the sprint races themselves, because that's more at fault of the current regulations, struggling with overtakes as it is. But the sprints do take a big part of racing out in these regulations. In normal races nowadays, we get some action for the first 5 laps, and the field starts to settle, and we don't really see any action until the teams start pouring into the pits, and a lot of overtaking is done through strategy. But by introducing a format that heavily encourages you don't have pit stops, you're taking out what makes most races interesting in modern Formula 1. Also, by taking out that strategy, the drivers starting from the back literally have no chance to score points. I fully understand that it should be hard to make that progress from the back, but there's a big difference between making it difficult and making it borderline impossible. This means drivers have to make outrageous moves on lap 1 just to have a chance at entering the conversation to score points, and if not, they're just joining the other half of the grid in running practice laps. Take for example this past sprint we had in Austin, where the turn 1 incident with Piastri, Hülkenberg, and Alonso, which resulted in damage for all 3, and took Piastri and Alonso, as well as Lando Norris, out of the race. Now, I'm not going to point fingers at who to blame for the incident, because that isn't my point I'm trying to make. The point is, you have 3 drivers who started P3, P4, and P6, going 3 wide into the sharpest turn 1 on the calendar. The truth is, they were never going to make it out of that with all 3 cars being unscathed. But with all 3 of them needing to make progress in turn 1 for their own personal benefit, none of them were ever going to yield. And you can decide what you want when it comes to which driver's at fault, but to me, it says more about the format that turn 1 progress is so make or break in these races. Hopefully, these issues can be addressed with the new regulations next season, because it looks like no change is going to happen to the format itself, and the new cars are supposed to make for better racing, but doesn't that sound familiar? Anyways, not only do these sprints tend to be a bit despised by fans, but drivers have outwardly said they aren't too impressed either. For example, last year when the new format was revealed, Logan Sargent said, "I don't think it's great having a sprint race when you're much slower than the qualifying lap and then going straight to quali." Although I'm not an F1 driver, I can see why he would be bothered by such a thing. Other drivers like Lando Norris, Sergio Perez, and Max Verstappen have all warned against adding more sprint events because they add a lot more strain on the mechanics and team members. Speaking of the team, you also have to note that these sessions take away free practice. Now, I know most fans won't care about free practice because it's not as entertaining to watch, but you have to acknowledge how valuable they are. As it is with the new rules of teams having to run 2 FP1 outings per car with rookies, practice sessions are already being limited. And with 6 sprint events, given that they don't give up both cars to rookies on the same weekend, that's a total of 10 races out of 24 where the teams don't have full practice running with their full-time drivers. That may not sound bad, but with the amount of development going into these cars, and the changes between the cars and the tracks year to year, practice is necessary for both driver acclimation for the weekend and gathering data for the team. Another thing about those practice sessions is that they're just a lot more safe. Now, I'm not saying that in the protective way, but rather considering the cost cap. Realistically, 2 more competitive sessions means 2 more opportunities to bin the car, and with teams already struggling to keep it under the budget, it just adds another element to worry about. I mean, look at Williams last year, struggling with the amount of money and parts they lost due to crashes late in the season. At the end of the day, it really is difficult to decide where to go from here, and there are some other formats F1 could follow, but it doesn't really have a clear-cut option. To begin with, they already have a well-functioning system with sprints in F2 and F3, with 1 qualifying session and a sprint race with the reverse grid for the top 10, and the sprint not influencing the feature race whatsoever. But a reverse grid just wouldn't translate well to F1. As much as it doesn't end up being, F2 is labeled as a spec series, and because of that, you can call it more just to use a reverse grid. When it comes to F1, putting a guy like Max Verstappen in 10th instead of 1st is not going to stop him, and putting a Haas that ends up on pole stands no chance. Funnily enough, we can actually point to the sprint in 2022 in Brazil, when Kevin Magnussen was on pole because of the whole weather shenanigans. And come the sprint, at the end of 24 laps, he barely hung on to the single point he achieved in P8. Something like that just isn't feasible for the F1 level. Another approach I saw on social media recently was using other track layouts for the sprint. Circuits like Bahrain, Silverstone, and Interlagos all have other track layouts that can be utilized, and it sounds pretty cool, but it really is just a logistical nightmare. Imagine having to deal with relocating grandstands for the sprint sessions and then back for the race. It really just isn't a good idea either. The only way something like that could work would be spreading out the sessions over 2 weekends. But at that point, it's just a completely different event and not a sprint anymore. And to be honest, I don't think we need any more than the 24 race weekends we already have. There really just isn't a solid format that makes sense. I mean, other series like NASCAR have functioned with phases in races, and having stages can advocate for some more interesting strategy moves and bring in a big reward system for those midfield teams, and just add some spice in general. But I struggle to see how it would translate to F1. Also, IndyCar used heat races in 2024 at Thermal Club for the $1 million challenge. But separating the field into 2 groups of 10 just isn't something I could see F1 actually following through with. So I struggle to find a real answer to what would work. Many fans are calling for keeping the practice sessions and getting rid of the sprints altogether. And although it does seem harsh, how much of an overreaction really is it? I do really love the idea of introducing more racing, but out of all the ideas I've seen, there's not really one that really addresses all of the different issues that the current format has. What would you do? Propose a completely new format that solves the issues, leave them as is, or just completely scrap the whole idea altogether? I really just can't decide.